Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished at the bottom of page 1465. Yeah. Let's sum up what we learned, and then we'll continue. From the beginning of page 1463, the Rebbe Rashab returned to a theme that began on page 1350. He said, Now, after all these 113 pages, you'll understand what it says, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, as was discussed earlier, that the Ner, which is called Nishmas Adam, Ner Hashem, Ner is made up of a psila, a wick, that feeds off and draws the oil into it, and creating a light, a divine light, divine love. And what are these three things? The psila is the nefesh halekis, as it comes down in a very defined psil structure, like we discussed. It's a limited flow, like the kav, which is like a psil, like a wick, a thread. That thread is immersed within the body and the animal soul, which is the shemen, the fuel that can be used for the wrong things or for its own selfish purposes, or in this case, where it becomes a ner Hashem, is when it's fueling the divine soul, by the divine soul explaining and allowing the animal soul to understand and appreciate godliness. And more than that, the divine soul actually feeling and experiencing love, and the animal soul learning from that as well. So that creates that they join together the oil and the wick to create this light, the divine light. That is, in sum, what we've learned. The last piece we learned in that context of that process is why the Yesh Lemer that we learned yesterday, last class, why is the Nefesh Habam is called Shemen. Why? Because Shemen is the essence of everything. There's oil within everything. The animal soul is rooted in Toyu, and Toyu also manifests the etzem of every sphere, the keser of every sphere. That's its intensity. So therefore, one drop of oil, qualitatively, is like the power of an entire thing, because it's concentrated in the like he says, the atzmi shel asfira. And that's Rav Tvuz B'Keyach Sheir, the very power of the animal, much more than the human power, the ability to, the concept of plowing, but the power of the animal, which is in the same thing in a drink when you mix in the essences, or the essence of a particular item, that will have an effect on the entire mashka, on the entire drink. U'misakne, and will either improve it or flavor it or transform it. To Moikain, the same thing, every bitter that comes from the animal soul, excuse me, increases light and energy in the divine soul. Last line on page 1465, where we stop. And that's why the Nefesh Habam is called Shemen Koyach Atzmi. However, as we explained, the Koyach Atzmi is untapped yet. It's very powerful, but it's not been directed or harnessed yet. That's why you need the Nefesh Halekis to harness it and to draw from it. And when it draws, it has immense, tremendous power. So this really adds very much to the idea of Shemen being the animal soul. But again, you have to then harness it and draw it out. And when you do that, the power then will go toward divine purpose, to divine ends, including increasing the Ava, increasing the light in the divine soul, as we learned earlier, and we'll learn again soon. Like we said, that Dafka the Nefesh Habamis, if you go back, just to give you, again, context here, where he began talking before Shcherani on page 1455, he said these words. Why Ishen Einai, Why neshamas are called the pupil of God's eye? Because like a pupil is dark. It's the darkness that brings out the eyesight and the vision. And he said, the very core faculties of the soul come through the animal soul, as he explained there at length. But so the soul has this tremendous power, but that power is concealed when it comes down below. Like he says, when a neshama comes down below, then so it fits very well to what we're describing here. Because why? Because an animal soul is a atzmi. It's coming from the core, like the oil of toyu. And that's why it adds and increases such a level of avarab and avabetainugim. You look at the end of the top of the page of page 1455, and from there he went into Shcheira and Ivanova, I am dark and beautiful. So that's like the context, to give you more context of what we're talking about here. Okay. So with that, we finish page 1465, to turning the page to 1466, and we'll start learning from the top of the page. And the pages can be found, if you want to follow the text, at Ayin Beis, ayinbeis.com. Okay. Vahu, how it continues and says, okay, now that we've established that the shemen, the oil, the essence of everything, within everything, is the general level of the animal soul. So now he says, Vahu nimshach, this atzmi, this koyach atzmi of the animal soul, when it's properly harnessed, so that it becomes oil, and nimshach is drawn achra psila. Where's the oil going? So the oil on its own could have gone anywhere, could have fueled the person's own, the seichel anushi, or the seichel TV of the nefesh abamis, the natural intelligence of the animal soul, like we learned earlier, that can go towards satisfying its own needs and pleasures. To use the limtzei tachbulas, to find all kinds of ideas. Lahasig hein v'oisher. I'm reading from page 1464. To acquire wealth and treasures and wealth, or gedula v'kavod, or vanity and glory. That's where the oil could have gone. But here, the oil is being drawn to what? To the psila, to the wick, the nefesh alikis of the divine soul. That's what's happening here when there's the proper avodah. This doesn't happen automatically. This is the avodah we have. Is to make sure the shemen, okay, so now once they're put together, when you see what happens, the oil is not being squandered. The oil is being directed and being drawn in, being absorbed by the wick, in turn creating a fire, a flame. The Yeridus nefesh alikis, because the descent of the animal, of the divine soul, like we learned earlier on page 14, what I just said, 1455, the neshama didn't come down for itself. It came for a purpose. It came to be levader, to refine. I mean, literally, levader means to clarify or separate, clarify, refine, sakin, and repair or improve. Harness, you can also use the word esa nefesh habamis, the animal soul, say, and to illuminate and illuminate it. That's what the nefesh alikis is there to do. To the point, not only that it doesn't follow its own animal instincts, that it should be transformed from darkness to light, like we learned again earlier. Back on page 1460. And earlier, that the thirst of the divine soul also should affect the animal soul, and should be a transformation of darkness to light. Va'oz. And when that happens, so what happens to the shemen, this powerful force in the animal soul? Then, when it's being drawn, nimshach achar psila, drawn and following the wick, then harihu nichlul ba'ed alikid nefesh alikis. Then the animal soul gets encompassed in the light, the divine light of the divine soul. And that's where the Shemin is feeding and fueling the wick, which in turn is creating Ner Hashem, is creating a divine light, divine love. V'hainu, and now he spells out, not just on a low level, but all the way, v'hainu b'chinas bittul di'yechud di'elah. I'll explain in a minute why he's going all the way up there. Which means a bittul, not just of Yechud Tata, a bittul yesh, that the yesh of the animal soul is now being harnessed toward kedusha, toward holiness, but it's even the bittul of Yechud Ilah. Remember, we learned about a Mayrich Be'echad, that the goal is not just a bittul on a lower level, but the bittul begins on a lower level, but then you climb and climb until you sublimate and acclimate and sublimate, and that the animal soul should be completely absorbed and completely consumed with divine love. And not just of the lower level, all the way in Atzmus. That's ultimately the goal. So he's telling us right now, again, I mentioned it was dense here and very brief. In truth is, if you break it down at many levels until the animal soul reaches there. But the Reb Rashab is summing up everything we've been learning. And this is critical because this is going to be, as I mentioned yesterday, the ultimate interface. Because you want the animal soul to also participate in the interface with the highest levels of bittul. Not just to say, okay, the nefesh alikis is connecting to the highest levels of godliness. Nefesh abamis is not disturbing, or at least is being harnessed, but it's still on a lower level. We want a full interface. That this world, the neshama as it came into this world, that this world should be completely transformed, including the body and the animal soul. And now he adds, as shall be explained with God's help. So you see here clearly he's developing a theme here, which we're going to talk about. And this is where the mimer of the Mittler Rebbe comes very seriously into play. And we'll see how later, because it's all about not just affecting the animal soul, but elevating it all the way to Yechud Ilah. Similar to what we learned earlier, Mutfe Morgish Muskel, that even the initial emotions of a child, of the animal soul, on the lowest level, you want it to elevate all the way, like remember the Shiluach HaKan, when you say Shalach to Shalach Sa'im. So that in the beginning, the mother, Bina, takes care of her fledglings, of the Midas, and educates and trains them. But then comes a point where the Midas mature, that they propel Bina, the mother, and Chachma, all the way into Keser, all the way to the highest levels of Bittul, of Muskel, Mutfa, Murgish Muskel, and even higher, into the Shinai and the 370 lights of Arich and Atik, gazing at the forehead and gazing at the essence of Atik, and even higher levels than that. So that's the ultimate goal, the full interface. And that's what he's saying here very briefly. The Bittul of Yechud Ilah. Now Yechud Ilah, we know in Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So Echad is first Yechud Tata, is a lower, in Baruch Shem, it's Yechud Tata, which means there is existence and you're recognizing the divine within existence. Yechud Ilah, it goes beyond existence. You reach recognizing the divine beyond existence, and all of existence is simply just an expression of the divine power. But he says he's going to explain this later with God's help. So we'll see how that develops. So just keep that in mind, the very key line here in understanding the whole connections. But what we see from this is that this now explains. So now once we know that Shemen is the essence of Tayu, is the animal soul, the Shemen now is being directed and harnessed properly by the Psila, by the Nefesh Lekis, and indeed it gets consumed, Nichlal, encompassed and consumed in that Oyer Lekir of Nefesh Lekis, all the way to Bechinas Bitl of Yechud Ilah. That's what the animal soul. So the animal soul began as a self-contained, self-interest oriented entity, egocentric. And now it's been transformed into being God-centric, completely focused toward godliness, which is the ultimate birur. Remember the process he said, this is the purpose of existence. That's why we were sent to this world, to make a dirah b'tachteinim, a home, and we're in tachteinim. Tachteinim, in a personal level, on a microcosmic level, is your animal soul. your body, your animal soul. On a macrocosmic level, it's the entire world, the material world. But it begins with ourselves. So transforming your material self, namely your animal soul, is the purpose of it all. And not just transforming it, but all the way elevating it to the highest levels of Yichudei Allah. And that's all alluded to when we say Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the neshama that comes down to this world, Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Habamis, comes a Ner Hashem, a Ner that combines the oil of the animal soul, feeding and being drawn into the psila of the wick of the divine soul and creating this Eir Eliki, transforming the darkness to light and creating this tremendous Eir Eliki that is to the point of Bit Yichudei Allah. Period. Not finished yet, but I'll stop if anybody wants to ask anything. So continuing on, the Hine, he's going to now explain why we talk on the Yichudei Allah. It would seem much more fitting that you're talking about the animal soul, that you're getting to Yichudei Tata. As I said, Yichudei Tata means the lower Yichud. You look at existence and you recognize the glove of existence is a glove to the hand of the divine, that everything is really divine energy within it. Yichudei Allah is saying there's only the divine and all of existence is completely nullified in that presence. So why does he mention Yichudei Allah? So he says, because in the divine soul, the ultimate good and the light, a divine light, the ultimate divine goodness and light, it's the higher level of Bitl, of Yichudei Allah, that there's nothing but God. Because the Bitl of Yichudei Tata, which is a Yichud within in the parameters of existence, that's the level of that, which is the level of Das Tachten. So again, he's referring to terms that we haven't read recently, but we've read them earlier, especially in the previous volume. So Das Tachten means the perspective from below. Das Elyon is the perspective from above. We want to join the two in the interface. So he's saying the Nefesh Elikis, the ultimate divine goodness, divine good and divine light, is a bitl of Yichudei Allah. Because the bitl of Yichudei Allah, which is Das Tachten, the perspective from below, that's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In this itself, there's still a mixture of good and negative, good and evil. We learned this earlier, that if you recall, that the two Eitz HaChaim is the tree of life. Tree of life is Kuli Elikus. All it is good. Life connected to the source of life, godliness. Eitz Hadas is connected to this world where there's two paths. There's Toiv, there's a good, and there's evil. There's what's right and what's wrong. So there's a taruv, there's a mix. Yes, we come into that world of Eitz Hadas. And the goal is to reach a level, not just of clarity, but reach the highest level. So it says, so the bitl of Yichudei Das Tachten is the level of Eitz Hadas, Tevera. I have to find where it was discussed earlier. I remember at the bottom of the right page. But I'll look it up a little later. Okay. There's still a taruvis of Ra because the world is also has an element of concealment. So it's true. You can get beyond that by connecting and recognizing godliness, but it's still a godliness in a world that's not perfect. Shalom. So in Ageres occasion, Tanya, in the section called V'hoya Ma'aseh Tzedakah Shalom, I forgot, I think it's maybe 50. I'm not sure which section in Ageres occasion it is. Taruvis Ra Shebenafshe. There he talks about the Taruvis Ra in his nefesh. There's still like a nefesh abamis, still has Ra within it. So that's when you're dealing with that, what you can expect is Yichudei Tata. But the Nefesh Elikis is not that way. We'll soon get to Nefesh Elikis. For whom it pnei, and that's due to the fact we're still talking Das Tacht. Kibedas tachten, because in the lower perspective from below, when we look at godliness through the lens of existence, whereas das en is looking at existence through the lens of the divine, das tachten is looking at the divine through the lens of existence. Habitlu bebchinas yesh umurgish. So there's bitl, but it's still bitl on the terms of existence. So the bitl is in a state of yesh umurgish. You feel it, you experience it. You're not completely absorbed in it, in the godliness. So even though there is a bitl, but it's still bitla yesh. So therefore, neisin makim, it gives room, it leaves room the taruv isra to something that's negative. Why? Because you haven't completely transformed the yesh. You've harnessed it to some extent. You've directed it. You've sublimated. You've tamed it. V'ze'in habchira, and that is the choice that we have. Shekashem sheyachal lifcha b'teiv. That's the world of bchira. We have choice. That just as you can choose good, yet can yachal lifcha b'heipa chas v'shalom. So too can you choose the opposite, God forbid. This is all describing bittul of yichud tata das tach. We're soon going to get back to the nefesh l'kis. So that's on the level of bchira. Ukamoi came ba'amidas. And the same thing on the level of emotions. Habayim mizeh. The same thing with the feelings that come from these choices. Mipnei she'hein b'murgish. Because these feelings are they're murgish. You're feeling yourself. I'm experiencing, let's say, love to God. It's not, there is no I. You're feeling it. B'bchinas yesh, mi she'oyev. There's a yesh, there's an entity that feels that love. Yochalias avazara kaneda. Because there's still a self there. So even though at this moment you're feeling love to God, but since there's a self, it's possible there should also be an avazara, a strange love. Avazara means a love to the wrong things, not to godliness. Because the yesh has not been transformed. The yesh has been so-called, like he says in Tanya, by the Beinani. You've directed the thought, speech, and action of the Beinani are directed in the right place. But the Nefesh Abamis has not been changed. It's still active. You have self-mastery, self-control. I'm not saying this exactly that level, but just as an example. And therefore, it's not the ultimate bittul. It's not the true bittul of total nullification or total sublimation. So what is the true bittul? So he goes now back to where he started. All this yichud tata. What is the real bittul? Zeu tachlis hatev. The bittul of yichud elah, where there is no yesh, where you see all of existence simply through the eyes of God. That's tachlis hatev, like you said before. Tachlis, the ultimate good. And that's the true level of the divine within the soul. Meaning here, the divine soul. It has that type of awareness, it can achieve that level of perception and awareness. And when it's effective, the wick of the divine soul in turn impacts the shemen of the animal soul, that nasa bittul, this level of bittul, this level of bittul causes not just that you tame the animal soul, not just that you harness it, but you actually transform the darkness to light. If I recall correctly, in the end of the paragraph on page 1460, he says something like that as well. I'm just looking. Yeah, that isapka comes from a deeper level of ava. Yeah, not just iskafia. It's very much connected to that. Look at the end of the paragraph on page 1460. Okay, let me just finish this paragraph and then I'll stop for questions. So that's chashech l'neh. Okay, so that's a deeper level of bittul, which is the ultimate goal when the shemen becomes completely absorbed and completely dissolves into the psila, into the wick, becoming one to the point that gets transformed from darkness to light. not just in a limited way, which still has the potential to go in the wrong direction. And if you think about it in the example of a flame, it works very well. Because when you think of, let's say, the idea, when you take oil, if the oil is being used for the wrong thing, it can go toward, like he said, l'ra, to something that's negative. Or avazara. The shemen is fueling the wrong type of love. But when the shemen is now being used by the wick for divine purposes, there's no room for the shemen to do anything else. It can't be doing two things at once, because it's one flame that's being fed from the fuel of the oil into the psila, the wick of the divine soul, and it's in total control. So the shemen is completely becoming divine fire, nothing else. That's the ultimate experience of the bittul of the nefesh habamis that he's describing here. The ze inyan hapsila, shu nefesh alikis. And this is the inyan what he says in Torah Eir, the Maimon Chanukah. She said that psila, the wick, which is the divine soul, shu b'chinas memutza. That's what the Alter Rebbe calls it. It's an interface. Lahamshika oir lahoyres nefesh habamis, to draw the light of the flame, to radiate and illuminate the animal soul, not just to illuminate it, but also that it should become part of, like a partner and encompassed in the Eir Eliki that is turning the flame, because the wick without the oil won't create a flame, a proper flame. The Eir Eliki, the neshama, should be encompassed and feed and become one with the Eir Eliki, the divine light of the soul. By Dezen Nasa, and then comes the other side of it, how it's not just the animal soul is feeding the divine soul and becoming one with it, but it now increases something, like we learned earlier. By Dezen Nasa Dibia the Nefesh Alikis. And it doesn't just accompany the divine soul, it actually causes greater energy and greater light to generate greater light and energy of the divine soul. The virtue, the power, the quality of light that comes dafka from darkness. Like we learned that the nefesh habamis, it increases the divine soul's power. Just like the oil makes the wick much more powerful than it would be without the oil. That's on that dafka, and that through the descent of the soul below dafka, explicitly below, specifically below the b'chinas, the neshama l'maylo cannot come to such level of love, of thirst, of longing, of avarab, of great love, and av of the delights, pleasures. U'kamoshin is bar le'il, as we learned earlier, page 1455, that I referred to and on. Yeah. 1455 and on, especially, yeah, all the way to 14, yeah. U'kamoshin is bar le'il, like we learned earlier, be'inyan shcheirani v'nova. Like we learned earlier in the idea that shcheirani, I am dark, but beautiful. So yes, and initially the nefesh halikis goes into a dark place, but through that darkness comes to a state of beauty even higher than Bnei Yerushalayim, than the daughters of Yerushalayim. The neshama says they are in Atzilus, to the point that you recognize that all those Giluyim are also desolate, lifeless compared to Atzmus. All this comes from the wick engaging with the oil and transforming the oil into divine fire and divine light and divine love. So as I said, he brought together many things here, a little more details, somewhat concentrated, but I think it's pretty clear. And with that, we finish this paragraph. In many ways, we talked about the neshama. This concludes a certain section here, but let me stop here for any questions, if there are any questions.
I have questions more Chassidus applied. Well, he's stating here the ideal state of affairs, the ideal state of elevation of humanity to Yehuda Ilah, but at the same time, he's talking about a level that's a level of a tzaddik. It's high. It's even higher than a Beinoni, and we all know it's very difficult, even just to be a Beinoni, to gain complete control over your Yetzer Hara. But still, you have a Yetzer Hara, and he's saying here that it's a level higher than, because there's no taruvos, there's no longer evil. So I'm wondering, on the one hand, I get it. He's setting up a system explaining the function of the nefesh behema and which is the shemen, and so in that sense, it clearly explains the functionality of interaction between the soul and the body. In that sense, it's completely perfect explanation. But on the other hand, as a practical matter, like is the Rebbe Rashab saying ultimately everybody can be a tzaddik, or is the Inyan that
well, he doesn't use the word tzaddik here, does he?
No, but what's the difference? If there's no more evil in a person, right? Then they're tzaddik. They're
well,
completely
as
good.
I've always say, when it comes to personal application, everything is relative, like he says in Tanya, in chapter 13. Everyone has to look at their level and look at how they can grow in that level, and just take these ideas and take it to the level. Everybody has examples of bitla yesh in their lives. There's examples of yichud ilah. Like just like some people, let's say during the year they may be on one level, and month of Elul or on Yom Kippur or Shana Yom Kippur may be in a higher level. I think it's just a matter of translating these levels instead of looking this as this is not about Chassidus is not about physical levels that you reach. It's not like someone runs a marathon of 10 miles or 20 miles or 30 miles. Chassidus is all relative. It's all giving you the concept of different levels of experiencing godliness. And this is a general template of it. And everybody has to apply that to where they are. Just like Tanya, there's different levels as well, even in the Beinoni. So it's just a matter of understanding, finding a way to apply these levels according to your particular level. I would not ever look at anything. This is a black and white standard. The Rebbe Rashab is putting it in broad terms, giving us the picture, and everybody, but really is speaking to everybody, from the highest levels of neshamas, people who have worked their entire lives, to people who are just beginners. And everybody can find ways to, like we say, every day we say V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Before that, we say Shema, we say Baruch Shem. And we've learned what all these levels mean. Each of us have to find how that applies to us, and it's completely not relevant how someone else experiences it. I mean, you can compare notes, but everybody has to figure out what it means to them. That you need a mashpia, talk to someone or work it out and find the different ways of applying it. I'm not going to go into it here right now because I don't want to get into the applied part of it. But that's a general, what I just said is a general formula for everything in Ayin Beis and Chassidus, and for that matter in Torah. I mean, the Torah itself has also tremendous high-level statements that, what else is God asking you? Nothing more but just to have complete fear and awe, complete reverence of Him. Moshe says to us. So it all comes down to the different levels that we have within us, as the Alter Rebbe explains. Everyone has a Moshe within them. But I think I've gone over this a few times. So that's simply how you have to look at this.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think all of us can identify with the Nefesh Habamis and the challenges it poses. The question we have to ask is, how much am I harnessing my animal soul toward divine purposes? And is it just a harnessing, or have I actually learned to figure out how to transform part of it in some way that it should experience something really on a higher level of a divine awareness? I'm not saying everybody's reached that, but relatively speaking, those are the questions that you have to ask yourself. The good news is that everybody has a neshama, and it's a ner Hashem nishmas adam, the capacity to be a fire, a flame, and it has a psila, a wick, and the neshama comes down into the physical body and animal soul, and there's shemen waiting to be tapped into. On a broad scale, if you use technology, or you use your whatever skills you have, or your career, or your work, and use it toward Kedusha, in a way, you're turning the physical world into oil and fuel for the divine. Now the question is, to what level, as we're discussing here? To what extent? Is it total? Is it partial? Is it Eitz Hadas? That's Das Tachten. Teverah, there's some partial good, partial not. And then there's the higher levels of total sublimation. Mashiach comes, obviously we'll have finished the job of thousands of years of the refinement and the elevation of the animal soul, that it will become an equal partner. And more than that, will even feed and nourish the divine soul. In some ways, tshuva, when a Baal tshuva takes their past and the great thirst, like he explains in Tanya why Baal tshuva is higher than a tzaddik, because he's taking negative and transforming it into a positive force. So that's yet another example of turning shemen, turning the darkness into light. And there are many, of course, other ways to express this, manifest this. Okay. Just some food for thought. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Now, so we've discussed Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. But now comes the next verse. Remember the Torah Eir, and even the Rebbe Rashab, when he quoted it back on page 1350 through 1352, and returned to it again on top of page 1463, there's a second verse where the word Ner is used. Ner mitzvah, the Torah Eir. That Ner mitzvah, the candle of a mitzvah, and the light of Torah. And now that's where the Rebbe Rashab is going to direct the discussion. And here is where I pointed out, I think there are ideas that I at least have not yet found, and maybe when we read it closely, we will see. The Rebbe Rashab is going to ask some questions, and I don't think they're answered directly, which means that when he finishes Ayin Beis, we're left with certain things not completely finished. But I repeat again, I think based on what we've learned and what we will learn, and based on the Alter Rebbe, excuse me, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the beer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, I feel confident that we're going to be able to get almost a clear picture here. But we now have to enter that domain, and that is, how does he explain Ner Mitzvah? And of course, the obvious question is, if all this is done through the Neshama, is already Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, what does a mitzvah and a Torah add? Of course, this is critical to the whole theme that we've been learning, that the Neshama below needs external light, a siyua, the support of light, the malachim, but also mitzvahs and Torah, especially Torah Eir. That's how the whole theme, that's how this whole section began on page 1350. So this is now what we're entering into a discussion of how we explain Ner Mitzvah. And again, with the same idea that the Ner is made up of three parts. So if you remember when we summed it up on page 1352, it was very brief there. That's why it's critical to go back to the Torah Eir and its explanation and the Mittler Rebbe's explanation, long mimer, to really understand how these three things apply in a mitzvah. So that's where we're entering now, the next paragraph. That's a short introduction. And so I don't want to jump the gun and start talking about where this is headed. I'd rather learn it together and let's see how it's developed. And keep in mind that the issues that may still remain lingering as we continue to learn this. But this is the next section. He's starting to do so. So let's learn inside. It's a new section. Vihine. New paragraph on page 1466. Vihine, and now Nizbarli il, it was explained earlier, the ner mitzvah yesh b'zeh ken gimel in ayin yonim. That the candle of a mitzvah also has these three things: the shemen, the oil, upsila, the wick, the oil, and the light or fire it creates. Ulahavin ma'u inyan ner mitzvah, and to understand what is this idea of the ner mitzvah, the candle of the mitzvah. Umahim gimel inyanim anal, and what are these exactly? These three things in a mitzvah. So the Rebbe Rashab clearly sees that need to explain it. Because when we look in Torah, even though you could more or less figure it out what it is, but it's not 100% clear. If you remember back on page 1352, especially when you start adding Torah, what does Torah come? So we know that Torah is like etzem ha'or, and ner mitzvah is not etzem, it's a more espashus ha'or. So, but clearly there's much more needed to understand and explain all of this. Now, what we did say earlier is the following, that and I'm just looking back on page 1351 at the bottom. He said the psila and the mitzvah is the Ratzon Elyon that manifests in Dvarim Gashmim. So in the neshama is the divine soul that manifests within the body and the animal soul. That's why it's a psila. In the mitzvah is the divine will that's manifesting in physical objects. That's the wick. And when it comes to, however, what's the shemen? What's the shemen? So let me just see. And then he says, so the shemen would be the physical objects themselves. So the mitzvahs, just like the neshama, the divine soul draws from the oil to feed its love and light and divine light. The mitzvahs use the gashmis of this world, the shemen of this world, to turn it into a mitzvah for Hashem. That's what it seems to be the pshat in Torah, and as he cites it here in Ayin Beis. And then he goes and says, Torah is a higher level of Atzmus, Atzmi, Atzmus Ein Sof. The Torah goes even deeper than the mitzvah, and it reveals a Atzmi. But the Torah too needs to manifest through mitzvahs. So the Torah also needs to grasp onto the wick, because the Torah is such a highlight, and the mitzvahs are the way that expresses the God's Torah into action. So he says the mitzvahs the mitzvahs connect the light of Torah with the human being and the world. So basically, he's saying it's very similar to what the nefesh halakis, the psila, the wick of the divine soul does to the animal soul. It turns it into fuel for the divine. So the same thing here, the psila of the mitzvahs are drawing the Torah and being like a mamutza to connect it with the physical world and elevating the physical world, which would be the shemen, toward godliness, and in turn creates even a greater light. It doesn't say that explicitly here, but it seems that way pshat in Torah and especially in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimon. So I'm just summing up some of what it says in order to help us understand what we're going to learn further here. But there's a lot more to discuss about this because it's not, as I said, absolutely clear. There is a part in Torah that I definitely wanted to read on page 39b, I believe it is. Yeah. But I'm going to continue learning it inside in those Maimarim and then share with you my findings. But bottom line is, what so far we've said here is we have to understand Mao Inyan Ner Mitzvah or Mahe Magimel Inyanim Hanal. What's the union of the Ner Mitzvah and what are the three things in the mitzvah of the oil, the wick, and the light? So he says, to understand that, Yesh Levayir Oid we need to further understand that which was discussed earlier, that neshama b'yidas lamata, that the neshama, when it comes down below, even though shemekabelis siyua ma malachim, even though it receives support from the malachim, remember, like the light that needs to give the ability to illuminate so the eye could see. So even though it receives that support from the malachim, when beizbananus the birchus yetzer in the contemplation in the birchus yetzer, we say before Shema. So first we begin with the malachim to prepare and support us. Nevertheless, Mekol Mokim. So even though we're getting their support, but who sees? Is the eye that sees. And the same thing in the Nimshal, who actually transforms this world? It's not the Malachim. Habirur v'atikin nefesh habamis. The clarity or the refinement and the improvement or harnessing of the animal soul, le'ira liful b'abitl, to illuminate it and to cause effect in it. Bittul that we learned about. That comes with the very power of the neshama. Just like the eye sees, it just needs a light to shine in a dark area so the eye could see. But who sees? It's the eye. So we learned explicitly that it's the neshama itself that ultimately does this aveda. It's only the support that it gets from the malachim. So he says we have to understand more what this means, and that will help us understand the idea of Ner Mitzvah and the three things in the Ner of the Mitzvah. That's how the Rebbe Rashab is positioning this. So he's taking us back now to that whole discussion that the Neshama Lamaila is a very high level. Comes down below, it needs siyua and support to get it going to trigger its inherent powers. So we need to understand that further. And what do we need to understand? So he says, Ulahavin zeh. So we need to explain this. Ulahavin zeh, to understand this. Why is it dafka with the power of the neshama that we're able to achieve this level of refinement and transformation of the animal soul? So that's number one. Why is it dafka b'keich of the neshama? It's a question. Additionally, ve'eich, another question, ve'eich yichela, excuse me, ve'eich yichela neshama lifel habitl b'nefesh habamis. How could the neshama affect such a bitl in the animal soul? Shu b'teikev hayeshes denega heipach habitl legamri. How indeed does the neshama have such power? The nefesh habamis itself is taken hayeshes. It's intense, self-absorbed from klipas nega, where it does not relate to godliness. It's all about itself, like we learned before. Hepecha bitl legamri. On its own, it's completely the opposite, diametric opposite of bitl. Bitl meaning to godliness. It's all about itself. It's self-consumed. So the first question is, why is it dafka the neshama that does it? And two, how could the neshama do that? It seems like a tremendous achievement to create such bittul. Of course, we can speculate because the neshama has tremendous powers, but the Rebbe Rashab is explicitly spelling out this question. And here is where, as I said, I feel that the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer is critical to understand all this as it develops. But that's what he stated right now. And in order to understand this, yesh lahagdim tchila inyan krishma. So to understand this, we need to first preface what is krishma. The bepasha shena emer v'ahafta. That the first chapter of Shema we say v'ahafta, love God, b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, with all your heart, which means with both sides of your heart, yetzer tov and yetzer hara. Shazel adei yichud elyon b'pasuk rishon. B'sheni de krishma. And how do you come to that level of ahafta? Is through the yichud elyon, the higher yichud, in the first verse and the second verse, which is the yichud of yichud ilah and yichud tata, the higher yichud and the lower yichud b'shma ubarach shem. So in other words, he says to understand this, we need to go back to the structure of Shema. How does it work? Before we get to Vahafta, that also the Nefesh Abamis loves God, we begin with Shema Yisrael, which is Yichud Ilah. And then we go to Baruch Shem Kved Malchus Leilam Ba'ad, which is Yichud Tata. And it's after through that we come to after B'chol Avavcha. So by understanding this process of Shema, Baruch Shem, Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, which we learned already about these bonus. And remember, that comes after these bonus of Brichas Yetzer of the Malachim that offer support. Then we'll understand how this leads us to Vahafta, which is the transforming and affecting the animal soul. So basically, these questions I just asked, the Rebbe Rashab is saying, will be understood once we understand better this process, Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, that leads us to Vahafta b'shnei yitzarech. Cholavavcha b'shnei yitzarech. And I'm going to stop here right before the parentheses. Even though it's negayah, but we'll read that the next class. So what we've learned now is not any answers. He's just setting up the next entire section, which really will lead us to the conclusion of Ayin Beis. The next entire section where he's going to tie together many of the ideas we've learned. But you see here why he brought Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata in the previous paragraph, because he wants to bring us back to full interface, to the highest levels, all the way down to the lowest levels. Full interface from the animal soul being transformed. So the two big issues that need to be answered is why is it dafka the neshama that does this? And how can the neshama do this? When you're talking about a total metamorphosis, a total paradigm shift of taking a yesh, a self-absorbed animal soul, and turning it toward godliness, which seems to be exact opposite of what its nature is. So that's what needs to be explained, and we're going to understand it through understanding what Shema is really, in more detail. And I'll stop here for now, this class. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Rabbi, first of all, thank you so much for giving us this class when you're not feeling well. Really appreciate that.
Amen.
I just want to ask to go back to what he said earlier, the neshama, and I may be expressing this properly, but it's able to reach the Helam Atzmi beyond the Torah, beyond everything else, right? So is there a hierarchy then with, you know, what you're talking about with the Shemin and the Psia and the Or in between the Torah and the mitzvahs and, you know, what he's going to go into now? Is there a hierarchy, or are they all on the same level and they're all working in the same way, you know, toward the same goal? Does that make any sense to you, or am I just
I'm not sure what you mean by hierarchy. I will just say this. Living life is not one-dimensional. We have many tools and instruments and resources in our arsenal. So the soul is one of those resources, maybe the primary one. Mitzvahs are another. Torah is another. The malachim are yet another. So yes, they all are components that are giving us the abilities and tools and methods to achieve the purpose of our lives and achieve the purpose of existence. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking me.
No,
They're
but
not the same. They're all different tools. They're different. They
I
all have different, like we learned, prayer is primarily from the bottom up. Torah from the top down. Mitzvahs is somewhere in between, which we're going to learn about, which we'll definitely have to discuss. So I'm not sure which. So yeah, neshamas are rooted in the highest level, but then they come down and they need Torah and they need the malachim because they come down below, and below they're lower than the Torah is higher than they are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're asking, there's a whole discussion. There's a whole discussion. Sometimes we find the souls are higher than Torah. Sometimes we find Torah is higher than the souls, and he explained there are two levels of soul. Is that what you're addressing? I'm not sure what you mean by hierarchy.
I mean, the ultimate is the ultimate connection, right? And only the neshama can get to that.
But we said the neshama needs the support of so many
Yes.
things. Can the
No,
neshama get there without Torah?
No. What I'm saying is between Torah and mitzvahs and
you making, remember, it's not a popularity contest who is the highest level here.
No, I understand.
Each one has their role to play.
Okay.
And that's how it is in life. It's like saying, what's more important, the mind or the heart?
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop here before the parentheses and middle of page 1416.